And welcome to the Filmistines podcast, a podcast where we are challenged with articulating a love for art, cinema, and storytelling. Today I am joined by my slow friend, Lucy.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm glad you could join us, because today we will be discussing Adam Elliot's 2024 film, Memoir of a Snail. I'm always very interested in stop motion as a form of storytelling. There often seems to be a emphasis on some sort of crudeness in stop motion and its animation and art style, and that obviously holds up in spades. Here, it takes on a childlike kind of quality of how it was made. There's a lot to love in that crudeness for me, because I find a similar tendency in pottery, ceramics and stuff, which is very close and near and dear to my heart. But it's kind of funny because it's almost the Achilles heel of the medium, the form of storytelling, because we often get these kind of stylized stories, point of views, and even characterizations. And it makes me kind of just wonder, man, I wish this was a live action movie. You know, there's something special oftentimes caught in stop motion. And it does kind of leave me unable to maybe connect on some level. I almost have to approach it strictly academically because there's just no deeper impact. And I think that's very true for Memoir of a Snail. There is an awful lot I love about this film. And I don't know about you and everybody out there, but because of the type of animation, I think it's harder to connect. It's weird. It's a frustrating feeling. Especially a movie that is entirely too obsessed, as existentialists usually are, too obsessed with what they deal with, what they suffer through. This film is very Sartre-esque, obviously inspired by Kierkegaard's "You can only understand life, retroactively, backwards, but must experience it forward." I love something so simple being the crux of a film, and just completely wrapping that idea in one's condition. I also really enjoy the way this film is told. It feels very Wes Anderson-y with some, obvious Tim Burton kind of inspiration. The existentially dreadful narrator remembering the story and that being how it's displayed to us, I think is very cool, especially in the context of the existentialist. I love the metaphor of the snail. I love that these people are trapped. I love the embellishments of trying to process strangeness, things that you're not familiar with. And I love the sticking point of, it's kind of like when you're sick and then you become better. It's almost like you forgot how good feeling well feels. It's kind of funny. There's a lot I love about this film, but the animation, the art style, it kind of really does hold me back in a really serious way, and I may have to develop. I'm a little bit of a poser. I pretend I like animated films, but I just never let them break out of this box, that they're lesser forms of storytelling, visual storytelling. But I must say, I'm very curious how you feel about Memoir of a Snail. What do you think about this film?
I very much enjoyed this movie. Not what I was expecting. Not that I had any expectations, because I didn't know this film existed. But when you hear of a title such as Memoir of a Snail, I bet different things come up for a lot of different people. This movie works for me in so many ways. It almost feels like a coming-of-age story, but there's a wider range of age from a typical coming-of-age story. It's usually a very specific point of time, whether it's a toddler or a child or a teenager or a young adult. It's that specific moment of your life.
Yeah, that milestone.
Yes. And I also like that this felt as sort of a nod to not only Sylvia Plath, but a lot of acclaimed literary works. I'm with you on this story being told through this weird narration. She's not really telling us, the audience, but she's telling it to a snail, which makes it weird. And I like that in this story she tells us, or tells Sylvia, it's very biased to her feelings and what has happened to her at this point in time, and not really providing us any spoilers. And I guess one example of that is when she tells us that after they got separated, after their dad died, she says, "And I never saw Gilbert again," which by the time you end the film, you know that's not true. I like that it was specific to that moment of time for her without spoiling anything to the audience. We have these themes of isolation and connection, but it's told in such a great way that despite her flaws and her issues, we stay deeply sympathetic towards her. And it's amazing to me when a story can bring that out of you, bring out that deep sympathy towards this outcast kind of character, because I want to feel the sympathy for human reasons and not just because you are an outcast for the sake of being an outcast. This film balances really heavy themes with experiences, if that makes sense, which is what I think you're trying to say with having these philosophical influences. It reminded me of Betty Smith's novel A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, where these girls have this sort of warm outlook on their tragic events of their lives, but they sort of love experiencing life, and almost in a romantic way that makes these heavy themes maybe not hit as heavy, which is good. I also very much enjoyed all the characters. Every single one of them had so much personality, from Gracie to Gilbert to the dad to Pinky, even to the foster parents or all of Pinky's ex-husbands and the judge. I mean, even the guy at the magic shop had this sort of little background, this little detail that gives so much depth. I too love claymation. It's probably one of the coolest animating styles to look at. I love that you can see several sections where their fingerprints were at or where the clay was cracking. The small little details in the claymation was awesome. Gilbert's eye still stay in black even after he was punched, or the older people's skin looking so weird and almost tree bark like, kind of leathery. And there is a slight stigma to animation being kind of geared towards kids, but something about claymation just makes it feel more of the adult kind of animation styles, probably because of that crudeness.
Yeah, and I think they tend to trend more adulty as far as what they're trying to say, because this may be enjoyed by a child, probably at the most a teenager, someone who can identify some alienation in their life, some aloneness, some insecurity, maybe. Yeah, can you imagine a 5-year-old watching Memoir of a Snail and getting anything out of it?
I think they'd get bored.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, and I think even something like Wes Anderson's Isle of Dogs or Chicken Run has this quality to it that I could see children finding boring. This film is on the importance of human connection, the importance of having someone in your life, someone daydreaming with you, someone motivating you. It keeps not only the hope alive, but the will to live alive. This film is on the importance of living, and I think there's something profound here in its simplicity, but I'm 100% with you. There's something keeping me from completely loving this film. I never questioned the animation as that potential because the claymation's so freaking cool, but hearing it makes me start to think.
Yeah, there might just be some kind of strange disconnect in our monkey brains, because what if it was still claymation, but the characters were designed in a more natural, realistic way? What if it was live action? What's lost in the translation of its storytelling and visuals when it's presented in a different way? Yeah, I don't know what that disconnect is with something that is so stylized, because I do feel like when they are more human-like, like the anime movie Your Name, or even the recent Spider-Man Miles movies, there's something easier to connect to there, even though it's pretty much the exact same thing. It's not live action. So there's a strange, probably very primitive monkey disconnect that is hard to work out emotionally.
No, I completely get that. It almost feels like animation has the potential to be the poems of the reading world, where you have to put the work in, you have to break it apart, you have to really think about what the line means. Is it doing some clever little trick with the words or with the lines, with the number of words, with the number of lines, with the syllables? I mean, there's so much to a poem that I wouldn't be surprised if it's your least favorite form of reading, which it is for me. There's too much work in a poem. But when I get it, it's something so pretty cool. It's pretty freaking awesome. But at the same time, it's also so foreign to us. No one speaks like that. No one reads like that. That's not our form of communication. We're not out there speaking in haikus. Our closest thing to that are probably metaphors and similes. It's raining like cats and dogs. That's probably the extent to anything like that for us as far as communicating. So it almost feels like there's some work to be done in an animated film. And they really hit the nail on the head there with this reference to Kierkegaard, because Pinky says, life isn't about looking backwards, Gracie. It's about living forwards. And that's probably one of his most referenced quotes.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing having this almost retroactive fitting of personification through a representation like a snail being the crux of this film, of this idea. In general, it's very cool when you can have something like an animal represent an idea. It's usually much more trivial than that. You know, the snail might also represent being slow. But here they really kind of shove it down your throat that the snail represents an entire outlook on life. And with that said, it's kind of funny too, because I think the film starts off at kind of a snail's pace of developing Gracie and Gilbert with their dad. And by the time they're separated, it really starts to accelerate because of course it does. There's this emphasis on the day-to-day being more important and longer when you're younger, and things start to just exponentiate over time. There's also this emphasis on being trapped, being in some kind of cage type element, which we can see on the back of a snail. We see literally represented visually with Grace. Sometimes she feels like she's inside a shell.
Like she is a snail, yeah.
And she's obviously wearing the beanie thing the whole movie. She can't get rid of it. And even comes to the conclusion that you don't want to get rid of everything that come before. You know, you don't want to shed all of that. Some of that is important. A lot of that's important, but it can also be very destructive.
Yeah, and we have that great visual too with her window looking like a jail cell.
Of course, and it only goes further and further and is really over the top and exaggerated in the best existential way, where she starts to create this tighter and tighter cage around her with her hoarding, with letting go of any kind of control in life, by having Ken around, by relying on an irrational idea that Gilbert's going to come through. You know, at some point, statistically based off of every day to come before, Gilbert's not going to come around. Not that you should lose faith, but you can't become so dependent on an idea that was especially established when you were, 10 years old. She's a snail that doesn't move, right? The snail can only move in one direction. It can't go backwards. That's the point of the snail. It can only move forward. And that's the great irony, that she is a snail that doesn't move anywhere.
I'll slightly disagree with that. Just with some of the letters that Gilbert sends her can inspire her at moments. And there's something sweet about Gilbert hiding the truth of what he's really facing, not being completely honest with the cult-like torture he's receiving on the other end, trying to remain a little positive for his sister. And during one of those letters, that's what inspires her to get the job at the library to do something with her life, which is where she meets Pinky. But it is still at a very slow pace. How many letters from Gilbert did it take for her to do something? It's sort of like I said earlier, there's something very sweet about having people around you. Because if you can't motivate yourself at that moment, doing it for someone else can get that spark.
Yeah, and it kind of goes to show you that you're your biggest obstacle.
Exactly.
as dreadful as one can feel, you still have little brief moments of maybe something in the other direction. Yeah, obviously her getting some kind of job is a big move, but the film still goes to show you that no matter what, no matter how stagnant and stuck you are, the world moves without you. And a Ken-like figure, I like this representation through Ken too. It's really kind of funny and really out there.
Disturbing.
Yeah, I think the best echo in the film is when Gilbert is at the dinner table and his new foster family are like speaking in tongue or whatever, or really just gibberish. It's not really anything discernible in any way whatsoever, because it's just this Sartre-esque representation of processing something that is so uncomfortable. And what Ken brings to the table with his fat fetish, almost to like a human trafficking kind of degree, like it's very out of left field, but it's a great representation of the extremity of how people will take advantage of people like Grace, people who are stuck. They even thrive on that. We're very familiar with 600-Pound Life, and you see that constantly, where there's this codependency, and they're both very sick from it. Like with Gilbert's foster family, there's even to a point where it starts to look like they are worshiping the apple, when in reality you have this crossing of existential wires of processing this very uncomfortable situation where this family is very much dedicated to the family apple business while also being evangelist type folk. And it's really cool to see that kind of merge when in reality those things were obviously separate. No one is actually worshiping an apple like that. It's a little funny to also say that because based off of our perception of foster families, you might expect them to take advantage potentially of their foster child. But because this is an existentialist film, especially told from an existentialist's perspective, it's, to me, Gilbert's situation appears to be much worse than it actually is, and through kind of a Sartre lens. So everything is able to drive someone mad and make them deeply uncomfortable and fill them with angst. And I guess that's also kind of part of the meta-narrative, because letting yourself fall into a situation like Grace, because she let that happen to herself. The film does also go to show you how you can actually be taken advantage of, because what Ken does to Grace, I think, is also representative and her reality of what it can feel like someone's doing to you, and also the possibility of what someone could introduce to your life. And what I mean by that is there's just this extreme essence of being stuck. And it comes in different forms. Sometimes you're just stuck in your head and you're able to be like a high-functioning existentialist. And sometimes you're stuck in your bed.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And we also get a piece of that, a piece of her personality, through her reading these books. In a way, she's trying to maybe escape by reading, or maybe trying to find a connection or something to explain this world to her through reading. Which, by the way, I love this little jab we get about the trashy romance books not enriching her life and how her dad would be disappointed. There's almost something to be said there about be careful what you read.
And it's kind of ironic that she might have these standards of a quality of mind, but not a quality of life.
No, that's very well said. And that's almost that internal shell that she's built around herself. My world is in me, and not very well expressing it outwardly. I do love, by the way, that finding out about Ken and these pictures he's taken of her is the lowest point that kind of makes her wake up, and she starts making these changes, going on a diet, kicking Ken out, cleaning up her hoarding addiction, which is funny because something like Gilbert's death should have been that catalyst, but instead it was something more disturbing or maybe something more to the pride or to the ego that had that wake-up call. It's like you ignoring all the red flags your boyfriend gives you, but it's not until he starts cheating on you that you're going to put your foot down, that you're going to have that wake-up call. Or no matter how many times your doctor tells you your cholesterol is high, what's going to make you start losing the weight and get healthier is the pants not fitting. Or you see that picture of yourself where you look kind of, oh, maybe I should drop some weight. One of my favorite sections, too, is Pinky's introduction. It absolutely killed me that we have this old lady, and not only was she returning the books into a trash can right next to the return box, but her book titles were weird. She was returning Tram Sex, a book called Misery, and a book called Jesus Ate My Cat. I don't know if those are real books. I didn't look them up. But apparently she had been doing this for months. How many books has this lady thrown away? And then my favorite part is when she asks Grace, why are you dressed like an ant? And then Grace says, oh, I'm a snail. And then she just says, oh. It was so funny. And then Pinky turns out to be this very eccentric character and a very inspirational character for someone like Grace. We all sort of need this type of Pinky person in our lives. Someone to show us in those moments how to not give a fuck, not to be so uptight about things, not to care so much. And I love that little scene where they go get a perm. And just something about there being so much in this quick little nothing scene is pretty insane to me. Or maybe because a lot of us can connect to it, right? Who hasn't had a bad haircut or a bad hairstyle that they've gotten teased for or hated it? But at that moment, you felt so good going to the salon or doing it yourself.
Yeah, and it's those exact same mundane things that constantly drag the more pessimistic existentialists down.
Yeah.
But in that moment, you have Pinky kind of shining a light on, as long as you're expressing yourself and having a good time, you're beautiful. And that kind of starts to unlock something in Grace. Because it is the most trivial things that drag people like Grace down.
Because it's a complete stranger who happens to be at a stop sign, stoplight, whatever, that rolls their window down and says, oh, look at that. You know, whatever he says, that's a nasty haircut. I don't know what exactly he said. And her just breaking down from a complete stranger's comment. Does that ring a bell with social media? And all Pinky does is call him a wanker, whatever Australian term, and tells Grace, hey, don't worry about it. You're beautiful. Which is also a very nice part of the story. This very hopeful part of the story. Grace, although being who she is and being in those situations she was put in, is pretty lucky. Because what would have happened to Gracie if she would have been sent to something like the Garden of Eden and Gilbert would have been sent to these swingers? She was very lucky in the sense that she got put with these foster parents that, although in not the best way, still encouraged growth. She got put in a situation where she met someone like Pinky and them together building this company, I guess, where they went out and held people's hands. And having a person like that to get you out of the rough times.
Sure, but I also think there's an element of just embracing the random happenstance things that are weaved throughout everyone's life. Yeah, the story would have been completely different if Gracie was at the apple farm and her perspective on the whole matter would have changed, because we get her perspective of Gilbert's situation through his letters, right? And, you know, we have some visual representation of what's happening maybe in Gracie's head. But I do think there is this focus of just running into a thing that could change your life. It doesn't necessarily have to be a person. It's probably more entertaining when it's a person, or at the very least. But it's almost this mirror held up to people like Grace in her situation. If you would just embrace some of the things around you, it would probably bring you back down to earth.
Right. which she did as a child. She was in this situation with her mom passing away, giving birth to her and Gilbert, with her dad basically being a drunk now that he had his accident. But that never seemed to faze her.
Yeah, because her and her brother became codependent on each other, and that worked in that scenario. But it ended up damaging both of them
When
into
they
their
got
adulthood. Yeah.
when they got separated, exactly.
And especially for Grace, who I think probably dealt with it harder, depended on Gilbert more. She built this delusion around her world.
And I guess one of these characteristic traits about Grace that I really liked, that made me really sympathize with her, is this naivety and innocence that she has. And maybe I really liked it because that's maybe a connection that I found with this character. And she was almost forced to have this codependency with Gilbert because she didn't have a mom and her dad was pretty much a drunk, though they have these very sweet moments. Gilbert almost feels like he has to help her, he has to shelter her, because yes, she's naive and sweet, but she gets bullied. And she had health issues when she was younger. And I just love the details in this movie, by the way. During one of those hospital moments, they asked Gilbert if he would be willing to do a blood transfusion to save his sister. And yeah, Gilbert, not knowing what that is, thinking he will die, he still says yes, but then asks, how long until I die? And they're like, no, 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 and quickly explained what that meant. He wasn't going to die. They just needed him to donate blood. But it's very sweet moments like that. Or their scars, how they together make a happy face. And little young Grace reminds me of me in a lot of ways, reading her books, getting so emotionally connected to her books. And like I said, being a little naive. You know, her dad loved his tea. It wasn't tea, it was alcohol. But that's something I probably would have believed if someone told me that this man was drinking tea. Oh, that man just loves his tea. Or like when the judge tells her that he got fired or whatever because he was masturbating. And then she said, well, I thought that just meant chewing your food thoroughly. Or not really getting what swingers were. Just someone who likes to swing. Right? And of course, her silly little hat that she keeps as an adult. And there's just this cuteness around that I could see Gilbert wanting to protect his sister because of this. And I don't know, just something about that I absolutely loved.
Yeah, I really liked the relationship between Grace Gilbert and their dad, and how even though he, was a drunk and suffering in his own way, he still had this childlike kind of vibe, and they hung out a lot. They watched TV, even though the dad slept, and they'd have to clap at him. That's my favorite part.
Yeah.
Is when they clap at him the first time, he wakes up and he's like, oh, okay. And then the next time he dies right in front of his kids.
And them clapping to wake him back up, and he doesn't. I love that relationship too. I think that's also something that reminds me of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Francie, the main character in the book, has this sort of relationship with her dad. He's also a drunk. He can't maintain a job, but in a lot of ways, she worships him, and he's a hero to her because it's almost like those are adult things that don't matter to a kid. In a way, kids don't care that you have a job or not, that you drink or you don't drink. They care that you're silly with them, that you go on roller coaster rides with them, that you pretend to be sleeping and then eat all their jelly beans. Because there's a moment in here when they find, I think, $20 or win $20. I don't remember how they gained this money. And he wastes it on lottery tickets. And as an adult, you just think how irresponsible that is. But through a child's eyes, they're having so much fun scratching off tickets to see if they win or not. And that's something she loses as an adult. And maybe that's a bigger point, that that's something we all lose. And that's something a lot of us lose when we're adults.
A lot of those elements with the dad and like Pinky and stuff also kind of feel very familiar. Like maybe Adam had those experiences with a dad, with an uncle type thing, whatever. Scratching lottery tickets in the tub, clapping at someone with sleep apnea.
Like they were oddly specific.
They're just strange in such a way that it's like there's so many of them too. It just feels like they may have all come from the same person. Obviously, this film is a far cry from being autobiographical simply because of its existential nature. It's too, Kafka-esque. It's too metaphorical. That doesn't happen in real life. But the wrapping around with the mundane, the suffering, the self-destruction, the stagnation, the delusion around the idea of better understanding life backwards, but always having to experience it obviously forward. It just continues to fulfill that climax of like breaking out of it. Like that first day after being sick as hell. It's like, man, I feel like $1,000,000. I feel better than I did before I was sick, because you forgot. Does everyone feel that? Is that just me? When I'm sick for, 2 or 3 days, at that point I have forgotten what it feels like to feel good, to feel well. And then it's just kind of like a burst of light with Grace when everything just kind of clicks.
I know we briefly mentioned those foster parents that she has, but I want to talk about them and sort of what they represent. They gave her these participation awards, these self-help books. Their favorite color was beige. And I don't know how you felt about them, but not only did they represent a sort of satire on this modern upbringing of children, but it was also sort of a metaphor to the modern self-help world and how superficial a lot of that is. And I know Adam's trying to say something here, but I'm not sure quite what.
Yeah, it's kind of funny to bring up self-help books in the middle of a Kierkegaard, Sartre-esque, somewhat character study. Yeah. Study of a aphorism, maybe. Self-help books are obviously derivatives of thinkers like Kierkegaard. Today they are corporatizations of mental get-rich-quick schemes, but in this case, get happy cheaply. And we obviously live in this strange era of the self-help book. It's a large section in every bookstore. It's obviously a very lucrative side of the book industry. And they obviously all say the exact same thing because they're all a derivative of the exact same thing. So it's kind of funny to have this almost implication of this cult, maybe. They end up being swingers. It's a little weird, and I haven't given it too much thought what that might mean for the greater picture. But people like Adam and other thinkers of existential thought do roll their eyes at self-help books. Adam's obviously making fun of that here.
Yes, of course.
And it's one of those things that kind of makes fun of itself without knowing that it's a joke. These people who read self-help books are part of the joke. Are they in on the joke? I don't know. But the essence of self-help books gives this suggestion of having a recipe or formula to feel better. If you just follow these 10 steps, you'll feel good about yourself. You'll be happier. A staunch defender of any greater thinker is going to roll their eyes at that. And it's almost hard to not roll your eyes at Adam rolling his eyes at them.
Right.
And it's kind of funny because if I was thinking about a movie around this one aphorism of Kierkegaard, I wouldn't think to include the presence of self-help books. But it's so obvious once it shows up. It's like, yes, that makes so much sense, because the investigation of any kind of existential thought is inherently a satire of itself. And so it's a total necessity to include something like that. But it does serve kind of a funny thing. Like, I don't know how to... It almost makes me kind of think of those people who, you got a group of friends, someone makes a joke, and then someone else says the joke again, and then another guy says the joke again. It's just like they're all kind of repeating the joke and all laughing at each other. And that's not funny.
Yeah, I'm with you on the eye rolly thing. I roll my eyes at Adam, rolling his eyes at them. But then at the same time, why am I rolling my eyes if I agree with him? And I don't know if I would include myself as part of this self-help world, because of course I always want to better myself. Everyone should want to better yourselves.
Then for a small price of $19.99, you can read this book in
Exactly.
10 steps.
Exactly. It's so baity, and why wouldn't you give it a try? I cannot begin to tell you how many self-help books I've read throughout my life.
It's like a drug for the ego or something.
It is, but then you read them, and after the first two, you can become inspired, but then you continue to read them because you felt that inspiration in the first one, and they all do start sounding the same, very formulaic. And it's formulaic in the way that it's, well, make your bed in the morning. That'll trigger you to start with something productive for your day.
And we see that here in the movie. The small wins are big victories.
But the self-help book doesn't tell you that. It's such a confusing topic, especially with how big it's become. And I would even include modern therapy. And by that, I guess I mean sites like BetterHelp.
Write a letter to yourself.
Exactly. Write a love letter to yourself.
Buy yourself that cup of coffee.
Exactly. But then you have this want, this need to better yourself. And then you turn to philosophers like Kierkegaard. And that's not quite broken down to you in a step-by-step formulaic way, because it requires some thought and some introspection that the world's not quite ready for, at least to put in that work.
Well, that's kind of part of the problem, right? It's not a world problem. It's an individual's problem. One must negotiate and balance their suffering how they see fit. No one else can tell them how to do it.
Yeah.
And so, of course, then, you go on this hunt for inspiration, right? How do we manufacture inspiration then? No one's saying it's not challenging. In fact, the people like Kierkegaard, the studiers of angst, will be the first to tell you how challenging it is. All right, man. Well, thank you for watching Memoir of a Snail with me and talking about it here today.
You're welcome.
Do you have a budget guess?
I do have a budget guess. I'm going to go with $2 million. He doesn't have a lot of stuff out there. And even though animation can be tricky, it still tends to be on the lower side. After something like Flow from last week's episode, I'm also going to go lower on the budget. The movie's also an hour and 34 minutes. Not too long. So I'm pretty confident around my $2 million guess.
Well, it says here that it was $4.3 million.
Ooh.
So it was cheaper. It wasn't no $100 million Spider-Man movie. And it went on to make $1.9 million. It's probably going to do all right, though. Become a cult classic in the claymation world. I'm sure it's going to get a Criterion Collection print. It's going to be all right. And over on Letterboxd, with 129,000 people, they weighed in at a 4.1.
Wow, that's pretty high for a overall score. I might be around that area. I'm thinking around 3.5, 4 range. I have to think about this movie a little bit more, because there's something that's keeping me from absolutely loving it. I would recommend this movie. Would I watch it again? I don't know if this would be a repeat for me. I loved all the details that this film had to offer. I loved all the little penguin logos on the books. She had these weird quirks that right angles brought her comfort. That seems like one of those oddly specific details that Adam Elliot probably knows someone. Pinky's valuables being in a cookie tin. Her having cat hair all over, or I guess guinea pig hair all over herself. This joke on the cat lady. The scars on their arms. There's so many small things that I really enjoyed here. I enjoyed the claymation style. I enjoyed the story. I loved Gracie as a character. I loved her arc, her lessons learned. But there's something missing. I guess it could be that clash between the type of story it's trying to tell with the style it's being told in. I'm not sure. Maybe it does require a rewatch for me to settle on the score.
Yeah, I think this film is a solid 3.0. There's an awful lot I like about this film, no doubt, but there's something holding me back as well. Is it the lack of performance? Is it the art style? Is it the repulsion of thinking too deeply on, dreadful matters? I don't know, but it is a great film. But thank you again for watching this movie with me, and thank you guys for listening to this episode of The Filmistines. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Remember, we post every Wednesday and Friday with brand new episodes on all of our free feeds. Our next episode will be on Enora, the new Sean Baker film. I'm very much looking forward to that.
Sean Bacon.
Please look forward to that. Hope everybody enjoys that one. Remember, we post every other Monday on patreon.com/filmistines for Patreon exclusive episodes too. And remember to go subscribe to our YouTube. Come subscribe to our Patreon. Come request a film. Come right in. We appreciate all the support. Thank you guys very much. But until next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of The Filmistines. Thanks for tuning in and joining us on our cinematic journey. We hope you enjoyed the discussion and gained some new insights and perspectives on the world of movies. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform, especially Patreon at patreon.com/filmistines. And follow us on social media for more film-related content. We love hearing from our listeners, so if you have any feedback, suggestions, movie recommendations, or book recommendations, please feel free to reach out to us. Until next time, keep watching, keep loving the magic of movies. This is The Filmistines signing off.